How important are sulfur-containing foods? I think that is something you mentioned.
I have talked a lot about sulfur. I actually identified sulfate deficiency, I should say, as a key factor in autism before I even knew about glyphosate. So I got onto the sulfur idea early on in my research on autism, and I'm still convinced that autism can be characterized by a dysbiosis in a way, an inability to handle sulfur properly. And sulfur is an incredibly important nutrient. And we are also probably deficient in sulfur because glyphosate disrupts the ability of the plants to take up sulfur. So the plants that we eat become sulfur deficient when they're exposed to glyphosate. But worse than that, glyphosate messes up enzymes that are involved in making sulfate and in making the activated form of sulfate and in transferring sulfate from one molecule to another. All of those enzymes have what I call glyphosate susceptibility motif. They're very sensitive to glyphosate substitution for glycine. I talk about it in my book. And so I believe that glyphosate is disrupting the body's ability to make sulfated molecules. And those sulfated molecules are incredibly important, particularly in the brain, where there's a molecule called heparan sulfate that goes into the brain ventricles. And the heparan sulfate is essential for the development of the brain in utero. So for the fetus to have a healthy brain as it develops, it needs to have heparan sulfate, adequate amounts of heparan sulfate in the brain ventricles. And studies on both mice and humans have shown that the autistic people and the autistic mice have low levels of heparan sulfate in their brain. So that is a direct feature of autism that I think is a consequence of glyphosate disrupting the ability to make the heparan sulfate.
All right. So we mentioned a lot about glyphosate in the food. So what about water contamination? Is that a threat?
It is both water and air. I mean, if you live near the fields where the glyphosate is being sprayed, you're going to breathe it. And I think if you breathe glyphosate, you're going to get a lung condition that is that's pretty nasty. There's actually, I mean, I've talked about the idea that I have of it disrupting lung surfactants, again, because of the glycine problem. The glycine substitution problem can cause, those surfactants have a collagen-like stalk, and that collagen-like stalk is going to get messed up by glyphosate, and the lung surfactants will then be deficient. They won't be able to go out and do their job, which is in part to trap the microbes. So you're going to have a greater sensitivity to infection with viruses, but you're also going to have sick lungs. And I think that that's a possibility. I'm even suspecting that vaping is causing a strange lung disease that looks a bit like COVID-19. It's a non-infectious lung disease from vaping cigarettes. You know, these e-cigarettes, as they're called. And I suspect that glyphosate is a contaminant in those e-cigarettes because glycerol is the base of the cigarette, and glycerol is a byproduct of the biofuel industry, which is using the plants that are glyphosate resistant. The GMO crops are being turned into biofuel, and then the glycerol is a byproduct, which is then being used to make the e-cigarettes, and it's probably contaminated with glyphosate. I haven't tested it, but I'm suspecting.
All right. So one of the other, just taking a detour, one of the other things you speak a lot about is atrazine.
Atrazine,
So
well, yes, I certainly have. Yeah. Well, atrazine has
so
been shown.
is that akin to, is
Atrazine
it
is
similar
also
to
an herbicide.
glyphosate, or is there like?
Yeah, it's an herbicide, just like glyphosate. It has a different mechanism of toxicity, and I have not studied it anywhere near as much as I've studied glyphosate. But I do know that there's a researcher called Tyrone Hayes, Hayes. I've heard him give a couple of talks, and he's been very big on the idea that atrazine causes tadpoles to turn into, it causes XY tadpoles, male tadpoles, to turn into female frogs. They've become completely female with the ability to lay viable eggs when they're exposed to atrazine. So he's been really pushing this idea that atrazine is a disruptor, a hormone disruptor, endocrine disruptor, that's causing these frogs to be very confused about their sexuality.